Hello everyone, my name is Aakanksh Gurnani, and welcome to my YouTube channel Neuro Chat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart and support the neurodiverse community. Topics related to neurodiversity, autism spectrum disorder, and more. On the channel, I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists, seeking their views and updates on their latest work, research, etc. I will also chat with parents of neurodiverse kids and adults and talk about experiences of neurodiverse individuals. My guest today, Steve Silberman, is an accomplished writer and journalist known for his work on neurodiversity and autism. He gained widespread recognition with his book, Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. This book explores the history and future of autism through a comprehensive and empathetic lens. Silberman delves into how society's understanding of autism has evolved and advocates for a more inclusive approach to neurodiversity. Investigative journalism and storytelling skills have earned him several awards, including the Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction. His writings cover a range of topics from technology to culture. Mr. Silberman, welcome and thank you very much for the time today.
Thank you, Aakanksh. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for reaching out to me and asking me to do this.
Could you tell us about your journey to be a journalist and a writer?
Yeah, sure. Well, my journey as a writer started out in a funny way, which is in fifth grade, a teacher encouraged me to enter a poetry contest for all of New York City. And so I wrote a poem, which was a pretty geeky poem. It was called The Math Battle. It was about my problems with math. And it ended up winning the contest and going to a world fair called Expo 67. And that was really exciting. I got to New York. I didn't go to Expo 67, but I got to go to New York and they took my picture. And I remember when I was writing the poem, I was always very bad at stuff like sports, which is, pretty much all you're allowed to do or whatever if you're a fifth grade boy in a public school in New York. And so I was always, a klutz and terribly awkward. And so I had this feeling about myself that I was like embarrassed, people called me fat, which I was, and all this. But when I was writing the poem, I felt like, wow, I can do this. Like, it was almost like, the video games didn't exist yet, but it was almost like, wow, this is like a video game I can really play. And so I had a really good feeling of being creative in that way. And then later on, a couple of things happened that more directly led to Neurotribes. One of them was that this very famous reporter, he's now awful, unfortunately, but Geraldo Rivera, he ended up becoming a right-winger, but he came to my school. He was very young, and he had just written this groundbreaking story about the terrible treatment of people with intellectual disability and autism at places like institutions like Willowbrook. And so it was this big expose about how autistic people, they didn't necessarily have that terminology then, but people who were certainly autistic and people with intellectual disability and other conditions were treated as subhuman in these state-run institutions. And so he was really, he did a really important thing, and he gave this talk at my high school, and I thought, wow, journalism is a way that people can defend people who don't have a voice in mainstream culture. And that was really inspiring. And then connected to that, later on, I read a book by a poet named Allen Ginsberg, who's a very famous poet. He was a member of what's called the Beat Generation of writers in America, which also included Jack Kerouac. And Allen's poem is called Kaddish, which is the name for the Hebrew prayer for the dead. And it was about his mother who had schizophrenia. And She eventually died after having a lobotomy, which was a brutal brain operation. And Alan had to sign the permission form, even though he was in high school. So he felt very guilty, about that. And Kaddish is a book-length poem that was about not just people with schizophrenia, but it was about liberating people from mental asylums, basically, and institutions. And so in that sense, it was kind of similar to what Geraldo Rivera had done in Willowbrook. And I ended up getting really into Allen Ginsberg's work and eventually becoming his teaching assistant at a school called Naropa in Boulder. And the thing about Allen was that he was a poet, but he was also a very diligent researcher. And so he had these huge file cabinets of information about the CIA, and he really kept track of news events and wove them into his poetry. And I saw Allen, he was the most famous poet in the world when he was alive. And I saw Allen sort of acting in this very effective way to challenge existing stereotypes about people with conditions like schizophrenia. And he was gay, and I figured out I was gay sometime in high school. And so he became a big role model for me. And I became a journalist and, eventually ended up writing for Wired magazine and wrote a story in 2001 called The Geek Syndrome, which was about Asperger's syndrome, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome in Silicon Valley and other high-tech communities, was that I handed it in to the magazine, and then 9/11 happened. And so it was originally supposed to be the cover of Wired, but 9/11 happened. It was thrown into the back of the magazine. I thought nobody would ever see it. But then, much to my surprise, for the next 10 years, I got email almost every week from autistic people and their families. And they were saying, like, now I recognize what was going on with my uncle, who was always talking about World War II, or autistic people saying that they'd been told that they were geniuses when they were young, but now they couldn't even get a job, or they couldn't get health care, et cetera. And so for years after that article, I was thinking, well, there's more to this story. And, I wish I had time to write about it. And then eventually I did. And so I wrote Neurotribes. And so that was sort of a pathway to writing Neurotribes.
What inspired you to focus on neurodiversity and write Neurotribes, which is now a New York Times bestseller?
Yeah, well, the more direct, I suppose, chain of events was that in 2000, I went on a cruise ship, the only time I've ever been on a cruise ship. I have to say, probably the last. But so we went to Alaska, and it was a so-called geek cruise. It was an entrepreneur's effort to replace boring tech conferences in cities like Philadelphia or whatever with exciting cruises, but have these really high-powered tech entrepreneurs on the boat, and mostly programmers attending. And so to cover the cruise for Wired, I went on the boat, and the star of the cruise was this guy named Larry Wall, who invented a programming language called Perl, which was very, very widely used, and is still widely used, and has been incorporated into Microsoft software, and was very much one of the foundations of the early web, et cetera. So anyway, I asked him if I could come interview him at his house, and he was this wild, kind of eccentric guy. Every night to dinner, he wore a different fluorescent colored tuxedo. And I found out that was because a tuxedo shop had been going out of business, so was selling off its tuxedos really cheap. So he bought a bunch of like neon green and yellow tuxedos. And so I asked him if I could interview him at his house, and in Silicon Valley after the cruise was over. And he said, yeah, sure. I should tell you, we have a profoundly autistic daughter. And I didn't know anything about autism when he said that, except for the fact that, like everyone, including autism clinicians at the time, I thought autism was very rare. So I went to his house. I did the interview. His daughter wasn't there even. I did notice that he had made some unusual adjustments to the sensory environment of his house. Like he had replaced the bell on the clothes dryer with a little silent light bulb that light up. But I didn't know enough about autism yet to associate those changes with his daughter's condition. So then a few months later, I was writing another story about another family in Silicon Valley. The patriarch of the family had built the first computer in the Middle East in the 1940s. And I said to the sister-in-law of the woman I was profiling, can I come interview you at your house? And she said, yeah, sure. By the way, we have a profoundly autistic daughter. And I thought, God, that's funny. I thought autism was very rare. And so that got me into looking at autism. When I started writing, a lot of people sort of shared these theories with me, which did not pan out as true. Like, it's too much screen time that the kids are, looking at screens, or it's the silicon in the water supply, or it's the, they didn't have 5G yet, but it's the wireless signal. None of that turned out to be true. But what did suggest itself as true was genetics. And there was a guy named Simon Baron-Cohen who he's done some not great things, but he's also done some good things. And one of the things that he did was to look at high-tech communities and notice that there were a lot of people in high-tech communities seemed to have autistic traits or autistic kids. And later on, after I'd written Neurotribes and went to Google London, it seemed like about half the people in the room had an autistic kid, actually. And there were a lot of people in the room. So anyway, I ended up writing that story about autism in high-tech communities, and that's what led to Neurotribes.
And your book highlights lesser-known figures in the history of autism research. Who do you think has been the most overlooked contributor to the field?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. Nobody's ever asked me that before. And yes, I have a big suggestion in that regard. There's a guy in my book and in autism history named Bernard Rimland. And he was the guy who subverted or disproved, really, the theory that autism is caused by bad parenting. But it's not him I'm going to focus on. He was, in a sense, the first, one of the two first autism parent activists. Unfortunately, Bernard Rimland went from doing very good things like that to doing very bad things. Like he practically invented the anti-vaccine movement. He was one of the people who falsely blamed autism on vaccines. But his collaborator for the first autism parents organization in America was a woman named Ruth Chris Sullivan. And Ruth Chris Sullivan, who only passed away a couple of years ago, really, had a different approach to Bernard Rimland's For the Autism Parents movement. And unfortunately, partly because he was a man, Rimland's vision prevailed. And so now you have people like RFK Jr., who haven't learned anything about autism in 25 years, still trashing vaccines, and as measles and mumps are rising all over the world, much less COVID. But Ruth Chris Sullivan's direction was to think in terms of accommodations, support, and new laws. And she really laid the groundwork for what eventually became the Americans with Disabilities Act. So his approach was, what can we do to cure autistic kids? and that eventually Rimland eventually hooked up with this sadistic, actually, autism researcher named Ivar Lovaas, who used brutal punishments like electric shocks and everything to try to cure autistic kids. But in the meantime, what she was doing was trying to change the world in a comprehensive way so that kids like her son and all autistic people could have better lives and health care and employment and all that. And I sort of feel like Ruth Chris Sullivan, who started out as a nurse, and she was an early feminist, even long before the word feminist was invented. And she was also an early civil rights activist. So she helped to integrate the Nurses Association in Louisiana, where she was. And so she was very progressive. And I often feel like Ruth Chris Sullivan was the path not taken by autism parent activists, really, particularly in the 90s when, Jenny McCarthy was considered an expert. And really, if we had paid more attention to Ruth Chris Sullivan and less attention to Bernard Rimland's fear-mongering about vaccines, we would be in a lot better place, and not just with autism, but with communicable disease in general. I mean, RFK Jr. has suggested putting all research into communicable diseases on hold for, I think he said, 8 years or something like that. It would be catastrophic. We'd be going back to medieval times when, a significant portion of the population of Europe died of bubonic plague. But if we had gone with Ruth Chris Sullivan's direction, we would have more of what we now call the neurodiversity movement, which looks for ways of changing the world so that people who are neurodivergent can live happier and healthier and more creative and engaged lives. Can I ask, do you mind if I ask you, how did you get interested in neurodiversity?
It kind of started because, so my cousin is autistic, and I used to go to his house, and when I'd go to his house, and he'd stim. This is when I was pretty young, so elementary school. I didn't know what was going on, right? When I got older, my uncle brought it up in a conversation. He was like, "You should understand what he's going through. You should read a little bit on the topic." And so I didn't read that much. I watched a movie or two, but I started volunteering at a local community service organization for kids with autism and
cool.
a lot of neurodiverse kids. At first, it was kind of why am I doing this? I'd rather be playing video games or something with my friends. Right. After a few months, I started to see that what I was doing was actually making people feel better, because some of them, they don't, and this is a big problem that I guess still, and you probably know about this, in the community, that, they don't get out much, right?
Yeah.
That 4 hours that they spend with me on Sunday is probably the first time they're going out in the week. Right. So I really felt making an impact. That was, it made me feel good about how I'm spending my time.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So how do you see the neurodiversity movement you were talking about earlier evolving in the next decade? What are some big milestones you're hoping for?
Well, this may get to a later question, but one thing that is good is that even though the last 10 years or so in American life have been really disturbing and horrible politically, there have been quite a few advances in terms of representation of autistic people in pop culture and media. So I could mention any number of things. There's a hilarious comedian named Hannah Gadsby who identifies as neurodivergent, and she's made some comedy specials, including one called Douglas, that has one of the most powerful uh, advocacy sections on neurodiversity I've ever heard, but it's also really funny because she's a hilarious comedian and says things like, my brain takes me places where other people don't go. So that was a good one. Another good one, which is a little harder to find, is called it's a documentary called This Is Not About Me, which is about a neurodivergent young woman named Jordan Zimmerman, who was nonverbal and was completely, or non-speaking, sorry, I used the wrong term, non-speaking. And her teachers just wrote her off as unteachable, etc., predicted that she would have to spend her life in an institution. She was very angry, which is understood or understandable when you think about how it must be to not be able to express yourself in speech. Finally, somebody gave her access to what's called alternative and augmentative communication, AAC, with an iPad. And she was finally able to express her wishes and desires and preferences and agenda for herself. And she ended up getting a master's degree in special education. So this woman who would have been normally thrown away, discarded, and living out her life on the back ward of some state institution, is now an educator and is doing very, very well. So This Is Not About Me. You can find it on the web. Another great one, Pixar made a short called Loop, where a non-speaking young woman was played by an autistic young woman. And the character was also Black, which is huge because the typical media representation of autistic people is a nerdy white guy. So that was a groundbreaking bit of representation. It was also very honest. It wasn't like, it didn't soft pedal the challenges of being non-speaking in a speaking world. And so that Pixar's Loop was great. There was another recent film called The Reason I Jump, based on a bestseller by a Japanese autistic teenager. It's a great book, but an even better movie because it looks at autistic people cross-culturally in many different cultures, like, ranging from cultures where they get quite a bit of support to cultures where they're chained up in a backyard as if they're possessed by the devil. And so that was a very illuminating film. And it also, I have to say, I'm not usually a big fan of technological simulations of autism because I feel like they're often just stereotypical and goofy. But the camera techniques to represent sensory overwhelm and stuff like that in The Reason I Jump are great. It's a very, very effective film. And another thing that's great is that autistic writers, like there's a reporter for The Hill and many of The Guardian, many other publications named Eric Michael Garcia. He wrote a book called We're Not Broken. And it was really a history of autism from an autistic perspective. And that was something that I could have only dreamed about when I was writing Neurotribes. When I was writing Neurotribes, if you had an article about autism in the newspaper, they would have interviews with parents, researchers, and clinicians, never an autistic person, as if you were having an article about feminism that only interviewed men. So that is changing. So that's all good news. On the other hand, we have had in the last couple of years a real resurgence of anti-vax BS, if I may say so. And, Trump very much amplifies those messages. RFK Jr., who is running as a spoiler in this election, so Trump will win, and has admitted that he's running as a spoiler, is a nightmare. He went to Samoa and gave a presentation and then more than 80 people died, most of them kids, because he told people in Samoa that were having a measles outbreak not to get vaccinated. And so there is a real chance that the rise of right-wing anti-vaccine stuff is going to mess things up even worse than they were before. So I do feel like I'm encouraged by the strength and resilience of the neurodivergent community, but I think we're also facing some serious challenges in the years to come, particularly if Trump wins this election.
And I think that that spike of awareness you were talking about, it's like in the media as well, right? Like the media's portrayal of autism and neurodiversity has changed a lot over the years. So
Definitely.
what are like the, I guess, the big changes you've seen, and what changes would you still like to see?
Well, one of the best things is that now, if you have a story about autism in the media, autistic people are often quoted. It's no longer presented as an unbearable tragedy for parents. It's presented. Autistic people have more representation as a minority, with a very large minority, I might add, with an agenda of their own and needs and preferences and how they like to talk about themselves, etc. So that is one situation that has changed for the better in recent years, for sure. What changes would I like to see? I'd like to see more representation of non-white male computer geek autistic people, because it still is that way, particularly in series like The Big Bang Theory and all that. It's that's the most familiar image of an autistic person in media, and it would be nice to see more characters like the Black young female character in Pixar's Loop. I would like to see autistic interests be more broadly represented. So, everybody knows that autistic people are into, or some autistic people are into, technology or computers or Doctor Who or science fiction. In part, they know that because I wrote about it. But I'd like to see also, like, well, what about autistic weavers or autistic musicians? The most celebrated interpreter of Bach's music in the 20th century was this guy named Glenn Gould. He was almost certainly autistic. I don't like to diagnose people remotely, and I'm very conservative about that. But if you watch videos of Glenn Gould on YouTube, he stims, he gets up from the piano and moves his hands. I actually spoke to a waiter who worked in Glenn Gould's favorite restaurant in Canada, where he ate every single night when he was not on tour. He would order the same dish every night and sit at the same table. These things are suggestive of autism, and yet he was considered one of the greatest, or the greatest interpreter of, say, Bach's Goldberg variations, which he recorded twice. And they were both considered absolutely milestone recordings. But you rarely hear about autistic musicians, etc. And I am also a big fan of a band called the Grateful Dead, and which I saw over 300 times. And the Grateful Dead, among other things, really advanced the technology of sound amplification at concerts, and also really advanced taping of live music. And what I didn't write about this in the book, but the people who were involved in those efforts, many of them had autistic traits or were, frankly autistic, including Stanley Owsley, the man who designed their sound system in the early days. It was a revolutionary sound system. And also, he made LSD as well, and before it was illegal, and afterwards too. And so he used his autistic precision to make music more beautiful for people. So I'd like to see a broader representation of people using their artistic traits in various forms of media to do good things.
Like see the, I guess, stereotype in media that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And what are some practical steps that schools, workplaces, and communities can take to become more inclusive of neurodiverse individuals?
Well, one thing that schools could do is there is a body of thought called Universal Design for Learning that looks at ways of making a central curriculum available in different forms according to the best way that an individual student learns. So some students are primarily visual learners who learn from reading and images. Other students are primarily auditory learners who like listen to books on tape and etc. And Universal Design for Learning is a way to take a curriculum and personalize it for individual students with different learning styles. It's a very good way to think about programming a curriculum for a neurodivergent, inclusive body of students. Another thing that workplaces can do is that as a writer for Wired, one thing I noticed when I was at Wired was that if you ask young entrepreneurs and startup people what kinds of employees they're looking for, they often say, well, we're looking for people like us, real team players. That doesn't work if you want a neuro-inclusive company, which will make you a stronger company, because as Temple Grandin, who you've already had on your podcast, points out, she, as a neurodivergent woman, can see problems from angles that neurotypical people don't see them from. And so you actually become a more powerful and resilient company that can respond to changing conditions and unexpected events by having a more inclusive group of employees. But often this process of looking for people like us boils down to an interview where the potential employee is expected to charm the interviewer in a very neurotypical way and seem hip in the same way that the other people are hip. Whereas Temple Grandin suggests that autistic employees attempt to get jobs by showing the quality of their work rather than charming someone in an interview. So that's a way of thinking about the intake process that would create a more neurodiverse population in companies. Obviously, we still need laws like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act used to be a bipartisan cause. There are very famous photographs of George Bush and Bob Dole at the signing of the ADA. It's no longer true now that the current GOP candidate for president mocks disabled people from the lectern at his rallies regularly. So it's going to become harder to fight for laws like the ADA or extensions of laws like the ADA with the Republican Party being against them. But we still need to do more work on that. And also I think, one good thing that's just happening naturally is that as more diverse representations of autism percolate into pop culture, just normal people on the street tend to become more aware that they may, in fact, have autistic people in their social circles already. And those people just need more attention, in a sense, and more accommodations, and learn how to not pressure autistic people into social participation if they don't want it, but make sure that they feel invited, etc. So I do think things are generally moving in a good direction, with just a few things on the horizon that are threatening. Mm-hmm.
What advice would you give to families and caregivers of neurodiverse individuals, particularly those who may be struggling to find support and resources?
Well, there's another book that I would recommend, particularly for parents who are struggling with difficult behaviors that their children are doing. It's a book called Uniquely Human, A Different Way of Seeing Autism by Barry Prezant. And it reframes what's often called autistic behavior as human behavior, just a rational human response to stresses in the environment. And then he tells you basically how to communicate with your child so that you're more aware of what you can do to reduce their stress and overwhelm. So that's a book that came out a month after mine. Me and Barry instantly recognized that they were sort of sister books. I very much recommend that book. I can't recommend local support organizations because that's not what I do. I'm a historian. But there is an organization called AANE.org, I believe. It used to be called the Asperger's and Autism Association of New England. I think they took the name Asperger out. But they're a very good, very, very good organization that can offer referrals to families. And so those are a couple of my recommendations.
And what advice would you give to aspiring writers and journalists who want to tackle complex and impactful topics like neurodiversity?
Read a lot. If a young person comes to me and says, "Oh, it's so cool that you're a writer. I want to be a writer too." And then I say, "Cool. Who are your favorite writers?" There's only one wrong answer to that question. The only wrong answer to that question is, "Oh, I don't read that much. I don't want to be influenced." That's a very wrong answer. You should want to be influenced if you're a young writer, and reading great books. And it doesn't have to be in any particular subject area. As I say, Allen Ginsberg was a big inspiration to me, but also Herman Melville, science fiction. Just read widely, and your brain will sort of soak up tools that you can then use in your own writing. And you can kind of tell when you read writing how much reading a person has done. I'm reading a fantastic book, or have been reading a fantastic book called Becoming Earth by an author named Ferris Jaber. It just came out. I'm sure it's going to become a New York Times bestseller in the next couple of weeks, probably. I hope so anyway. And you can tell that he's read really a lot, and not just on the science of geology and how the Earth became a living planet, but he's also read like Virginia Woolf and stuff. So, read widely and in different genres, not just your favorite genre. It wouldn't kill you wouldn't kill a young writer to read some poetry too. I know that a lot of things outside of online writing have sort of fallen out of fashion. And, I must say, I'm almost glad that as a writer, I grew up in the days before the internet, because I had to read a lot, and I could even be bored without being able to look at my phone. So just read widely. I would say that's my biggest advice.
And are there any upcoming projects or topics you're currently working on that you'd like to share?
Yes, I am. My next book is going to be on cystic fibrosis, which has traditionally been a fatal diagnosis. Up until 20 years ago, most people with cystic fibrosis would die when they were teenagers or young adults. And I'm writing it because one of my best friends has cystic fibrosis. And when he sort of came out to me as having it, I realized that I would never have known him if it wasn't for these advances in medical science and societal support. And so in Neurotribes, I wrote about how changing definitions of autism created a community of autistic adults who could speak for themselves and relate to each other. And cystic fibrosis, a similar situation is happening, although for very different reasons, but a whole community has emerged among people with cystic fibrosis who would have been dead in previous eras. And now they're having to face things they thought they would never face, like marriage and having kids and planning for retirement and having a career. So I'm focusing on the societal changes that the survivability and transformation of cystic fibrosis into a chronic and manageable disease because of a series of breakthroughs. I'm focusing on that community. And that book is going to be called The Taste of Salt, and it should be out in a couple of years from my same publisher as Neurotribes, Penguin Random House.
So I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I wish you luck growing your audience and all that.
Thank you. It was a really nice interview.
Good. Thank you very much, buddy. Take care.